A single slap in a Seoul hospital ignites the fury of an underground king. And in just 72 hours, love turns violence into devastating justice and unexpected hope. The slap cracked through Seoul National Hospital's ICU like a gunshot. One moment, the room was filled with the familiar sounds of survival. Machines beeping steadily, soft footsteps, controlled voices. The next, everything stopped. Zara Thompson staggered backward as the diamond ring caught her cheek, splitting skin. The force knocked the breath from her chest before the pain even arrived. When it did, it burned sharp, humiliating, undeniable. Blood touched her lip, warm against sterile air, then dripped onto the white tile floor below her. No one moved. Not the junior doctor's frozen mid-step. Not the security guard by the door who suddenly found the floor very interesting. Not even the patient in the bed, breathing because Zara had fought for his life minutes earlier. Mrs. Park stood over her, chest rising and falling, Chanel sleeve trembling with outrage. Her voice filled the silence. Sharp, practiced, accustomed to being obeyed. Get someone like her away from my son. Like her. Zara's knees hit the floor. Her clipboard slid across the tiles, pages scattering like quiet witnesses. She tasted copper and shame as the room continued to hold its breath. She had just stabilized a critical patient in 11 minutes. She had done everything right. And now she was bleeding at the feet of a woman who believed money made violence invisible. So this is how little my life weighs to them. Dr. Kim finally found his voice, but it came out thin. Mrs. Park, please. This is a hospital. A hospital I donate to, Mrs. Park snapped, eyes never leaving Zara. And I will not have foreign hands touching my child. Foreign. The word hung heavier than the slap. Zara pressed her palm to her cheek, feeling the swelling already rising beneath her skin. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply looked up, eyes steady despite the sting, despite the humiliation burning through her chest. How could saving a life still make you disposable? Around them, the ICU felt different now, smaller, colder. Power had shifted, and everyone felt it. This wasn't about medical care anymore. It was about hierarchy, about who was allowed to stand and who was expected to kneel. Mrs. Park's diamonds caught the fluorescent lights as she adjusted her posture, certain the moment had passed. Certain this would disappear the way things always did for women like her. But something had already changed. In the doorway, unseen by most, a man had stopped moving. His hand slipped slowly into his jacket, not in fear, but in understanding. A text message was sent. Short, precise, irreversible. Zara's phone vibrated weakly against her thigh, screen lighting up through the haze of pain. She didn't look at it yet. She didn't need to, because somewhere in Seoul, a man who ruled through silence had just learned that someone had put their hands on the woman he loved. And silence, when broken, becomes thunder. This is the truth no one tells you. The moment you use power to humiliate the innocent, you invite a force far greater than yourself. Zara Thompson was used to swallowing things quietly. Disrespect, suspicion, the long looks that lingered a little too long on her name badge. In Seoul, being a foreign nurse meant learning how to smile while being measured, how to work twice as hard for half the acknowledgement, how to disappear without actually leaving. She had learned quickly. 6 months earlier, she'd arrived with 2 suitcases, a nursing license, and a belief that competence would be enough. It wasn't. Patients asked for Korean nurses the moment they heard her accent. Families watched her hands as if waiting for a mistake. Supervisors praised her skills in private and reassigned her cases in public. She never argued, never complained, never gave them a reason. Keep your head down. Do your job. Go home. And she did go home, to a place no one at the hospital could imagine. At night, Zara stepped out of scrubs and into quiet luxury. Glass walls overlooking the Han River. Floors that didn't creak. Silence that felt protected, not lonely. She shared that space with a man who kissed her forehead every morning and learned English jokes just to hear her laugh.
Kang Ji Hune.
To the outside world, he didn't exist or existed only as a rumor, a shadow behind legitimate businesses. A name whispered in rooms where deals were sealed and futures ended. Seoul's underground didn't call him king because he was loud or cruel. They called him king because when he spoke, things happened. When he didn't, things disappeared. And Zara loved him. Not the myth. Not the fear that followed his name. The man who made her coffee too strong and apologized every time. The man who checked the locks twice at night and once again in the morning. The man who begged her to take a driver to work because he knew what the city could do to people without protection. Why would a woman like her choose a man like him? Because he saw her before the world tried to make her small. They had met at a charity auction months earlier. She thought he was just another wealthy donor, quiet and polite. He thought she was someone else entirely. By the time the truth came out, it was already too late. Feelings don't care about consequences. Still, Zara kept her world separate. At the hospital, she was Nurse Thompson, efficient, calm, replaceable. She never mentioned her engagement, never wore the ring, never used his name. She wanted to earn her place on her own, without fear or favors. Ji Hune hated that part. "You don't need to prove anything," he told her once, holding her face like it was something precious. "The world already takes too much from you." But she went anyway. Every shift, every night, because Zara believed that dignity meant choosing kindness even when no one was watching. What she didn't know, what no one in that ICU knew, was that the calm woman bleeding on the floor was loved by a man who ruled chaos with patience. A man who hadn't used violence in months because loving her had made him want to be better. Until now, because secrets don't stay buried when someone crosses the wrong line. And the most dangerous people are never the loudest in the room. They're the ones why. The bathroom door closed softly behind Zara, but her hands were shaking too hard to notice the sound. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized. Cheeks swollen, lips split, eyes too steady for what she had just endured. Blood traced a thin line down her jaw as she turned the tap on and let cold water run over her skin. The sting grounded her. Pain was easier than humiliation. She stared at her phone resting on the sink. 1 missed call. 3 unread messages.
Ji Hune.
Zara had promised herself she would never do this. Never pull him into her battles. Never let his world touch hers. Loving him already felt like walking a thin line over fire. But something inside her had cracked in that ICU. "I can't carry this alone anymore." She pressed call. Across the city, Kang Ji Hune was standing in a private boardroom overlooking Seoul's skyline. The meeting had been quiet, efficient, controlled, just the way he liked it. Men in tailored suits were discussing numbers, ports, acquisitions. Legitimate words covering illegitimate power. His phone vibrated once. He glanced down. Zara. He excused himself without explanation and stepped into the hallway. The moment he heard her breathing on the other end, something shifted in him. "Zara," he said softly. "Are you hurt?" She didn't answer right away. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but too calm. "I'm okay," she said. I needed to hear you." That was all it took. Ji Hune leaned his shoulder against the wall, eyes closing for half a second. He knew her silences. He knew the pauses she used when she didn't want to be a burden. "Tell me what happened," he said, no longer asking. A tear slid down Zara's cheek as she described the slap. The words came carefully, like she was reporting on someone else's life. A woman, a hospital room, a moment that stole her dignity. On the other end of the line, Ji Hune said nothing, but the air around him changed. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled slowly into a fist. The hallway lights reflected off his eyes, now cold and distant. This wasn't anger. Anger was loud. This was something older, quieter, final. "Who?" he asked. Zara hesitated. "Ji Hune, please don't." "Who?" he repeated, voice low and steady. She whispered the name. The call ended gently, too gently. Ji Hune stood still for a full 10 seconds. Then he opened his phone again, not to call her back, but to send one message. Just 4 words. "Find her. Now." Around the city, engines started. Doors opened. Shadows moved. The king had woken, not because his power was challenged, but because the woman he loved had been touched. Was this the moment everything would change? Ji Hune adjusted his cufflinks and walked back into the room, his face calm, his posture perfect. The men inside felt it immediately. Conversations died mid-sentence. The meeting was over. Because when love is wounded, restraint becomes a choice, and tonight he was done choosing. The moral is simple. When you silence the innocent, you awaken forces you were never meant to face. The hospital lobby was almost empty, the night shift moving quietly like ghosts along the fluorescent-lit corridors. Every step Ji Hune took echoed against the marble floors, deliberate and controlled. But beneath the surface, a storm raged. Anger, love, and a cold, dangerous patience warred inside him. Zara sat in the small staff room, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee, her fingers trembling despite the mug's warmth. Every sound in the hospital, every distant beep, every footstep, felt amplified. She knew he was coming. She had felt it in her chest the moment she ended the call. Could I have stopped this? The door swung open before she could answer herself. He stood there, taller than ever, his dark suit almost blending with the shadows. His eyes found hers immediately, calm, but sharp enough to cut through the walls she'd built around herself. "Zara," he said softly, but there was a steel beneath the tenderness. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but she knew he could read every lie in her body. The air between them was thick, heavy with unspoken fears and dangerous truths. Ji Hune stepped closer, slow, measured, as though testing himself. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to strike, but restraint held him back. "Tell me what happened," he demanded. Not a question this time, but a statement. His voice had that quiet authority that left no room for denial. Zara looked down, her chest tightening. The choice was unbearable. Protect the woman who had struck her, or unleash the man who loved her, a man capable of unspeakable vengeance. "If I tell him, there will be no turning back." Her lips parted, hesitated. Then she whispered the truth. Not all of it, but enough. Enough for him to understand the danger. Enough for him to feel the fire she had feared awakening. Ji Hune's face remained composed, but his eyes darkened, shadows creeping across them. He inhaled slowly, holding himself in check. This was the man she loved, and the monster he could become. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" he murmured, a hint of reproach slipping through the control. I didn't want to drag you into my mess," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought I could handle it." He shook his head, a flicker of both frustration and admiration in his gaze. "You can't handle everything alone, Zara. Not this. Not anyone." The tension between them hung like a fragile glass, ready to shatter. She could see it, the raw edge of him, the predator coiled beneath the lover. She could feel her heart racing, her hands gripping the mug as if it were a lifeline. And in that moment, she made her choice. She would stand by truth and trust him to protect her, even if it meant awakening the monster she loved. Ji Hune finally stepped back, his restraint deliberate, terrifying. "Stay close to me tonight. I will not let her harm you again." Zara nodded, a mixture of relief and fear washing over her. The moral lingers in the air. Sometimes love demands courage, and courage awakens the fiercest protectors within us. The first time Mrs. Park realized something was wrong, it wasn't a scream or a crash that warned her. It was silence. The lavish apartment, polished to perfection, suddenly felt hollow. Phones stopped working, accounts froze, access denied. The world she had built on wealth and intimidation began unraveling quietly, insidiously, like sand slipping through her fingers. Ji Hune stood across the city, composed and unyielding. He did not raise a hand, did not shout, did not make a scene. Yet, his presence was felt in every locked screen, in every denied transaction, in every whisper of power slipping away. Mrs. Park's empire, built on entitlement and cruelty, trembled under the weight of his precision. Could someone be this methodical? She thought, panic creeping into the edges of her carefully rehearsed composure. Meanwhile, Zara watched from a distance, her heart caught between awe and fear. This was a different kind of force, the cold, calculated kind that could dismantle a person without spilling a drop of blood. It was terrifying, yes, but also a relief. The world had not needed another tragedy. It had needed justice. Mrs. Park's aides scrambled, phones ringing endlessly, emails bouncing back with errors she could not understand. She shouted, waved her hands, but the chaos was invisible, untouchable. Each step she tried to take toward control revealed another layer of her impotence. The walls of her luxury penthouse no longer protected her. They trapped her with the consequences she had ignored for so long. Her face, usually so sharp, so confident, twisted in disbelief. Every carefully constructed advantage, every connection, every influence, crumbled under Ji Hune's cold logic. The power she had wielded like a weapon became meaningless in the hands of a man who chose patience over violence. "Why can't I stop this?" she muttered, though the answer was obvious. She had underestimated someone who did not need to fight like she did. She fought with strategy. He fought with inevitability. Zara felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew the man beside her could have taken the easy path, could have let anger guide him, but he hadn't. He had chosen restraint. And in that restraint lay the most terrifying lesson of all. That true power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers and everything falls apart anyway. Hours later, Mrs. Park slumped in her chair, her empire shattered, not with blood, but with the quiet weight of accountability she could no longer evade. She had learned, painfully and thoroughly, that cruelty and entitlement would never protect her from consequence. Ji Hune's eyes met Zara's for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Justice had been served, cleanly and decisively. The moral lingers in the air. Sometimes the sharpest lesson leaves no wound, yet cuts deeper than any blade ever could. 72 hours. 72 hours that changed everything. What began as a silent dismantling of power in Mrs. Park's world now erupted into chaos visible to everyone. Headlines flashed across screens, emails forwarded in shock, whispers spiraled through elite gatherings like wildfire. Boards that had once bowed to her influence resigned in droves. Contracts she had thought untouchable were torn apart, signed away by those who no longer feared her name. How could one person cause such a ripple? Mrs. Park wondered, staring at her reflection in the mirror, pale and hollow-eyed. The Queen of Privilege had become the cautionary tale of Seoul's high society in less than 3 days. Every corner of her carefully constructed empire, every office, every partnership, every alliance, was unraveling. The scandal wasn't loud with violence, but it screamed with consequence. Colleagues she had once called friends now avoided her, their glances sharp with judgment. Lawyers shook their heads, clients withdrew, and investors whispered questions that could no longer be ignored. Her influence, built on decades of intimidation and connections, crumbled like brittle glass in a storm. Zara watched from a distance, her chest tight with a mix of relief and apprehension. She knew the system had been ruthless in its own way, but never so visible, never so public. The justice Ji Hune had orchestrated was precise. It left no room for argument, no space for retaliation, only the stark reality of accountability. This is what real consequences feel like, she thought, a power that corrects itself without bloodshed. Meanwhile, Mrs. Park moved through her empty offices, the hum of activity replaced by silence. Phones no longer rang. Assistants no longer flinched at her commands. Every announcement, every public retraction, every resignation letter piled on the invisible weight she could not escape. She had become a story told with lowered voices, a lesson for the ambitious and the careless alike. Even in her despair, there was an undeniable clarity. The world she had manipulated for her advantage now mirrored her own failings. Power without respect, cruelty without conscience, had never been sustainable. The whispers that once celebrated her status now carried her shame. Each passing hour, each new headline, hammered home a truth she could no longer ignore. Zara and Ji Hune exchanged a quiet glance across the city, a subtle acknowledgement of the work that had been done. No fists were thrown, no bullets fired, yet the impact was monumental. It was a lesson in precision, patience, and moral certainty. And as Mrs. Park disappeared from the spotlight, the moral became undeniable. True consequences are rarely loud. They echo in every choice, every action, and every ripple left behind. The city was quiet that night, but Zara's mind was not. She stood by the window of Ji Hune's apartment, watching the lights along the river blur into soft reflections. Everything outside looked calm, untouched by the storm that had passed through so many lives in the last few days. Inside, the silence felt heavier. Ji Hune stood behind her, his jacket draped over a chair, his posture relaxed, but she knew better. She could feel the distance in him, the careful restraint he wore like armor. "You didn't have to do all of that," Zara said softly, breaking the silence. "You could have stopped earlier." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low, honest. "I almost didn't." She turned to face him. For the first time since the hospital, she saw it clearly. The exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried so well for everyone else. "How close?" she asked. Ji Hune exhaled slowly, as if releasing something dangerous. "Closer than I want to admit." He looked at his hands, flexing his fingers once. "There was a moment when I wanted to end it quickly, permanently." Zara's heart tightened. She loved this man, but loving him meant standing near a darkness that could swallow everything. "Can I love someone who holds this much power and still sleep at night?" He lifted his gaze to her, unguarded now. "I stopped because of you," he said. "Because I saw your face in that hospital room. You didn't want revenge. You wanted dignity." Tears burned at the back of her eyes. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "And what if one day I can't stop you?" Ji Hune reached for her hands, holding them gently, as if reminding himself how fragile the world could be. "Then I need you to walk away," he said quietly. "Promise me that." The words hit harder than any threat. Loving him meant accepting that his power came with a price, a constant negotiation between protection and destruction. Zara nodded slowly. "I don't want to be the reason you become someone you hate." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "And I don't want my love for you to turn into an excuse for violence." They stood there, holding each other, not as king and nurse, not as power and innocence, but as two people choosing restraint over ruin. Outside, the city continued breathing, unaware of how close it had come to witnessing something far worse. The moral was painfully clear. Loving power means accepting responsibility, not just for what it can do, but for what it must never become. The ground where pain once settled did not stay empty for long. Months after the hospital incident, the city saw something unexpected rise from the silence. A modest clinic tucked between aging apartment blocks and crowded bus stops. No marble floors. No glass towers. Just clean white walls, open doors, and a sign written in 3 languages. Zara stood at the entrance on opening day, her nurse's badge pinned neatly to her uniform. The scar on her cheek had faded, but the memory had not. She welcomed patients with the same steady smile she had worn in the ICU, except now it carried something new, ownership. This place was hers. Ji Hune watched from a distance, hands in his coat pockets, his presence calm but protective. He had signed the papers quietly, funded the building anonymously, and insisted the clinic remain independent. No names, no favors, no shadows attached. "Healthcare should not depend on where you're from," he had said simply. For the first time since arriving in Seoul, migrant workers stepped into a space where they weren't questioned before they were treated. Language barriers were met with patience. Fear was met with care. Pain was not ignored because it came from the wrong accent or passport. This is what healing should feel like, Zara thought, her chest tight with emotion. She moved through the clinic with purpose, training nurses, translating instructions, holding hands when fear rose. Every patient reminded her of the night she had nearly broken, and of the choice she had made to stay. Ji Hune's world had changed too. He still held power, still moved pieces others never saw, but this was different. This was creation instead of control. Every life helped here balanced a scale he had feared tipping forever. One afternoon, A young worker bowed deeply after treatment, tears in his eyes. "No one ever helped me like this," he whispered. Zara smiled, blinking back her own tears. She didn't need revenge anymore. She had something stronger, impact. Ji Hune met her gaze across the room, a quiet understanding passing between them. He had learned that strength wasn't only about ending threats. Sometimes it was about building places where threats could no longer thrive. Wasn't this the truest form of power? As the clinic filled with voices, footsteps, and life, the past loosened its grip. Pain had not disappeared, but it had transformed. The moral was simple and enduring. The greatest response to harm is to build a world where it cannot happen again. The wedding was nothing like the headlines would have imagined. There were no flashing cameras, no displays of wealth meant to intimidate. Just an open garden on a quiet hillside, soft music drifting through the air, and chairs filled with people from different worlds who had learned, slowly, to stand side by side. Zara walked forward in a simple dress, her step steady, her heart full. As she passed faces, nurses from the clinic, migrant families, a few guarded men who kept a respectful distance. She realized how far her life had traveled from that cold ICU floor. At the altar stood Ji Hune. He wore no crown, no armor of fear, just a man waiting, eyes fixed on her with a tenderness that had once seemed impossible. The fury that once defined him had softened into something deeper. Discipline, humility, purpose. I didn't just survive him, Zara thought. I changed him. The vows were spoken quietly, but every word carried weight. Ji Hune promised protection, yes, but more than that, he promised restraint. He promised to choose building over burning, patience over impulse, love over pride. Zara promised honesty, courage, and the strength to walk away if love ever turned into fear. It was not a fairy tale promise. It was a real one. As their hands joined, cultures blended naturally. Languages mingled, traditions intertwined. There was no single side of the aisle, no division between power and service. Just unity earned through pain and choice. Could love really rewrite a legacy built on fear? When Ji Hune kissed her, it wasn't possession. It was gratitude. Later, as evening settled and lights flickered on across the garden, Zara stood beside him, watching guests laugh and share stories. She saw nurses teaching elders how to use their phones. She saw workers eating freely without lowering their eyes. She saw men who once lived in shadows standing in sunlight, learning a different way to exist.
Ji Hune leaned closer.
"You know," he said softly, "people think you saved me from becoming a monster." She looked up at him, smiling gently. "No," she said, "you chose not to be one." He squeezed her hand, accepting the truth. The king had not been defeated. He had been transformed. And Zara understood then that her story was never about being rescued. It was about standing firm long enough to change the direction of power itself. The moral is clear. Love does not weaken power, it teaches it how to last.